A SaberSim subscriber took down a solo $1 million win on Thursday Night Football of Week 2, and with the big improvements we've made this offseason to our NFL sims, projections, and ownership projections, I'm expecting even more big NFL Showdown wins to come this season. My name's Jordan Chan, I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and in this video, I'll teach you how to master the art of NFL Showdown. I'll lay out the fundamental goals you should have when building Showdown lineups, walk through the process of building on SaberSim, and explain how our sims help you achieve those goals, and then finally hand you the paintbrush to finalize your lineups. What makes Showdown contests particularly fun to play is that in many ways it really is an art, where you can add real value to the quality of your lineup portfolio by doing something in your process that is unique to only you. Now before we get started, I want to preface this by saying that this is a mastery video for those already familiar with the basics of NFL Showdown. If you're new to these contest types, I'd recommend starting with my How to Beat NFL Showdown guide linked in the description of this video. And a lot of the strategies I will discuss here are going to rely heavily on our contest sims, so you will want the SaberSim Ultimate plan to fully be able to follow along. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Let's start by breaking down the anatomy of a profitable NFL Showdown lineup. There are a few different levers at play here. First, there is a huge spectrum of possible game scripts that can play out on the football field. And for each game script that is possible, there is an optimal DFS lineup associated with it. That is, the lineup that scores the highest amount of points when that game script plays out. Now at a base level, we need to be able to build these different optimal lineups and identify which ones are most likely to be the actual highest scoring lineup when the game plays out on the field. Sure, a game with a 50-point implied total can end 0-3, but how often does that outcome actually occur? We're obviously going to be favored to come in first place more often when we play lineups that are more likely to be the optimal. But there is of course a second consideration here, and that is how often our opponents also play the same lineups as us. The first place prize in NFL Showdown is only given out once, as our lineups are duplicated or duped, our lineup starts to earn less and less money when it ends up being the highest scoring lineup. You've almost certainly encountered the extreme case of this before if you've played any NFL Showdown, where first place for the contest pays out a fraction of what it was actually listed as to hundreds or even thousands of different lineups that all tied for first and split a bunch of the prize pool. Because prizes in these DFS contests are so top heavy and first place represents such a large portion of the prize pool, a lineup's expected value, what you would theoretically make back on average by playing that lineup if the game played out over and over and over again, is very closely tied to how often that lineup comes into first place and how much of the real first place prize it earns when it gets there. So it's easy to see then that bad NFL Showdown lineups are lineups that have either very little or no chance of being the highest scoring lineup in the game, or lineups that fail to capture a lot of the first place prize when they are the optimal lineup, because they were duplicated by other lineups in the contest. Now this is a challenging problem to solve building lineups by hand or using conventional tools like traditional optimizers. Traditional optimizers assume players score their averages 100% of the time, but the average outcome obviously does not play out 100% of the time. And sure, the 0-3 outcome for the 50-point total is extremely unlikely, but how often is that game ending 17-10? What about 35-7? What about 42-35? Even with a strong sense of the full spectrum of possible game scripts, then what do the actual optimal lineups associated with each game script look like? How often is the 35-7 game a 5-1 stack, a 4-2 stack, a 3-3 stack? How often does the alpha wide receiver 1 on a team account for the majority of the touchdowns scored by that team? How often are kickers optimal in different game scripts? And even then, assuming you have assembled this pool of optimal lineups and identified the ones most likely to take first place, we also then come back to the problem of needing to be aware of how likely other players are to play these lineups in the contest. The tension here between all of these different competing factors is the reason that simulations are so powerful to beat these contests. So let's jump into the SaberSim app and I'll walk through how our sims work and why they put you in a position to succeed playing NFL Showdown by solving these problems. Now on the SaberSim app, we present the average point projections and the ownership projections for all players like any other optimizer, but there is a lot more going on underneath the hood here. We simulate each NFL game play by play 100,000 times, writing out the game scripts for what might happen on the field in that particular game. And when you click build, we are sampling the different game scripts, giving you the optimal lineup for 5,000 different ways that this particular game may play out. Let's get a build going here so you can see it in progress here. The only things I tend to change when I'm actually sitting down to build my lineups is I will bump up the number of lineups up to 5,000. I like to lower the min salary down to 0. You will never get lineups with that low of salary, but I don't like having a salary floor on NFL Showdown. And I'm going to make the 2 changes to abide by the DraftKings rules here that say we need to make 2 changes to projections before we start building some lineups. And then we'll go ahead and click build. And as this is building, it's assembling a pool of 5,000 lineups, each one of which is an optimal for a given game simulation that we have for this game. We know that the lineups will have the characteristics that it takes to be a winning lineup for this slate because they literally banked the sim that they came from and account for things like correlations, the wide range of potential outcomes, all of that good stuff here automatically. Now, after your build is complete and we're sitting on a pool of 5,000 lineups here, it's time for the second step of the process, which is running a contest sim. We still need to solve the problem of playing lineups that are still likely enough to be the optimal lineup, but that win enough of the first place prize when they are the optimal lineup to have that positive expected value. We do this in the contest sim by taking an expected field, the lineups we think your opponents will play in each one of your contests. We test out each lineup out of your 5,000 as if it was entered into that field, and then re-simulate the game 100,000 times. This way we can calculate the ROI of each lineup you've built, identifying for the given size of the contest you're playing and the payout structure if it is expected to be profitable based on how likely it is to be the optimal lineup and how many times we expect it to be duplicated. Once your contest sims are complete, you can just change your sorting method here to the contest sims, target contest ROI to get a best look at the overall best lineups from your pool. And you'll see the lineup's expected ROI in the different contests that you've uploaded to SaberSim, as well as how often we expect that lineup to be duped in each of these individual contests. Now from there, we can change our tab over to the autofill fill method to place the best possible lineup into each contest that you're playing based on its ROI from that particular contest sim. To do this, typically what I do is I will sort by the highest prize pool to lowest. I will again confirm that I'm set on the ROI sorting method here, contest sims, target contest ROI. We'll click unique rank and then click save to contests, which will put the best lineups into the 20 max, then the best lineup into the huddle, then the best lineup into the cover 4, and I could download this file and upload it to DraftKings, and I'd be good to go. Now, if you followed exactly these steps and played these lineups, you're already likely to be in a good spot. You've taken a pool of a potential optimal lineups here. You've calculated which ones are expected to make the most money in your specific contests, and then you entered them into those particular contests. And I would expect that in general, your overall lineup portfolios are going to have a positive ROI when you check back the next day to see the sim ROI in our post-contest simulations in Contest Flashback. However, if you are looking to take the next step and increase your expected profits even further, this is where Showdown really becomes an art. While the lineups you're playing with this strategy are expected to be profitable, I would expect them to end up being a little bit more duplicated than expected, and their actual ROIs to be a little bit lower than calculated by the contest sim. Now, why is that? Because if you and I find the same lineup that is expected to be unique, and it looks like a smash, and we both play this lineup, well then suddenly that lineup isn't unique anymore. And if a few dozen people all using Sims see that same lineup, you can all of a sudden guess what happens next. Now, before alarm bells start going off in your head worrying about hundreds of different players all running into the contest and playing the exact same lineup, we are already aware of this phenomenon at SaberSim. And the way your lineups are built and simulated in the contest sim is going to mitigate some of this here. There is a lot of natural variance in which simulations end up used in any given build you run on SaberSim, and there is variance in which game simulations are used in each contest sim we run. Not every single SaberSim user is going to get the exact same lineups following these same steps, and in fact, it's not even close. But there is a feedback loop of simulations saying that some lineups will be unique or have very low dupe counts, and those lineups ending up more duplicated than expected in the contest because other users saw that same opportunity. Which means that there is value in making your lineup portfolio for a given showdown game uniquely yours. And this isn't an easy task, and by definition, I can't hand you a step-by-step process on how to do it. As soon as I do, it's not uniquely yours anymore. But I've studied the top players for literally hundreds of hours over the course of seasons to identify what they do to add a little bit of extra value and make their process unique and their own. And I've had quite a bit of NFL Showdown success of my own, so let me lay out some ideas here for you to work with. Now, there are a few different ways that you can do this, and different DFS players are going to have different skill sets. So rather than trying to copy and paste exactly what I say here, take this instead as a menu of different colors of paint, knowing that it is ultimately you who needs to paint the picture each slate. Now, the first angle here is for the ball knowers out there, doing some extra research to make subtle adjustments to projections. Now, our simulations and our projections are based on a set of priors, what we know about how teams and how players have played historically, what they are doing in this season and what they have been doing recently, and then what we expect to happen in that particular game. And while our data scientists have spent thousands of hours making our projections and sims as strong as possible, there is going to be inherent fragility and noise in any projection model. For example, is a 2-game trend upward in the snap share of a given running back a true trend, or is that just noise or something random about those ways those particular games went? Was how a team reacted in a game where their starting wide receiver got hurt representative of how they will play the next full game without that player after they've had a week of practice to prepare? I often like to look at some of the data behind the player projections and see if I can identify any spots where players have extra upside or downside based on increased potential opportunities. And there are probably dozens of different sites online that offer this data, but I found lineups.com to be my favorite source this year, and I've dropped a link in the description of this video to the actual page that I end up pulling up here most of the time. My goal with this type of research is not to have an opinion on every single player in the game or to literally cross-reference every single player projection. I'll generally target my research on the lower projected players on each team where there's inherently a lot more volatility. For players who are high on the depth chart and frequently play every single snap, their data normalizes much more reliably, and I generally trust our projections for those players. But small changes in rushes, targets, or snaps for lower salary players can make a big difference in how they are used in your lineups, and there's a smaller sample size of available data for projecting those players in the first place. So I'll give a quick demo of how exactly I would handle this for the upcoming Cowboys and Giants slate, and by the time you watch this, you'll probably be able to see if I was right at all about any of this or horribly wrong. But I want to quickly note that thinking this way and this kind of process is not just something unique to SaberSim projections. Projecting the very low salary players in NFL Showdown is really a challenge for any projection model because of these limited sample sizes and the volatility there. So even if you're using other projections, I would encourage you to think this way and consider doing some of this research. So let's actually do this here. The way I typically get this set up is I will look at the flex column and I'll start with one of these teams or the other. So let's start with the Giants here, and I'll start to get a sense working really bottom to top on these projections of anything that stands out. So I really like to think about this from the standpoint of opportunities. So let's go ahead here and filter and look at just the Giants first. And the informational tabs that I think are most useful here is snaps and then targets and rushing attempts to just get a sense of who's out there, who's being used the most. So let's first take a look at the running backs here. And we see mostly just 2 running backs playing a lot for the Giants recently here. We see Devin Singletary mostly being the bell cow, Eric Gray getting a little bit of work, and then Tyron Tracy kind of operating as the running back 2. So we'll take a look at snaps and rushing attempts here. And one thing that kind of jumps out to me, a lot of times I'm looking for trends here. And we do see a bit of a trend with Tyron Tracy here. In weeks 1 and 2, really doesn't even rush the ball at all, jumps up to 5 rushes in week 3. And then also in the snaps we see here, it goes from 15 to 12 to 22. So we do see a little bit of an upward trend here. Now, Tyron Tracy is a rookie that I think is actually probably going to be pretty good. So maybe I'm coming in here with a little bit of a bias also. But I think he's going to be a pretty good player, and I could see the Giants wanting him to become a bigger part of the offense as the season goes along. This is a positive trend here, one that I think is interesting, and I think it's likely to continue. Now, you would want to check this with just an understanding of how the game went and make sure, you know, there wasn't an injury situation that came up or potentially an outlier game script where there's like a blowout or some reason why a player would have played far more snaps than normal. But the Giants played a pretty competitive, normal-ish game last week. So I think we can somewhat rely on the week 3 data as being real. So what I'm taking from this is that I think Tyrone Tracy is going to have a somewhat continued role in the offense here. I would assume that probably going to at least continue to get meaningful rushes. Let's take a look at targets as well. I'm curious how he grades out there. Targets in week 3 got a couple looks on targets as well, really operating as a legitimate running back too. So anyway, let's bounce over to the SaberSim projections and now take a look at this. So we can find Tyrone Tracy here. See, we have him projected for about 4 points. And then what I like to do is go and look at some of our detailed stats and see how that compares with what I just saw. So if we look at Tyrone Tracy here and we follow him all across, he's getting about 3.5 rushing attempts. He's getting about 1 reception here. And if we go back and look at the rushing attempts here, now, is it just because Tyrone Tracy got 5 snaps last week that he's guaranteed to get 5 snaps this week? Certainly not. But I am seeing an upward trend here, and I think I would probably assume that 5 snaps, 5 rushes is a reasonable mean projection for his rushing attempts here, right? I think assuming that his role is going to continue to increase, I assume that he's probably likely to play a little bit more than last week here, or at least the team's going to give him that opportunity if he plays well. So I think we're under, all this to say, I think we're under projecting Tyrone Tracy a bit, or I think we could be. I'm willing to buy on that opportunity. So if I'm thinking that his real rushing attempts is probably a little bit closer to 5 here, he's at 3.5. This is not an exact science, but I might go ahead and give him a little bit of a boost here and maybe bring him up to say 6 points or something like that. Maybe even 5.5. 6 might be a little aggressive. I don't necessarily feel the need to have huge stands with the way that I project players here, but I think we're a little low on him relative to that trend that we just saw here. And you can see we had a 0% Tyrone Tracy in our original run on our entries exposure. Now, as a part of that, I also want to see how we're projecting Devin Singletary, who doesn't really look like his workload is going down, but those rushes do have to come from somewhere. I am curious how we project him here. We're giving him 15 rushing attempts. I could see this being a situation where the Giants have the ball less if they're getting down early, but I think the game sims themselves handle a lot of that nuance. I'm not going to necessarily adjust Devin Singletary down here. I think you could argue that his workload goes away at the expense of Tyrone Tracy, but I think this is actually a fair projection, and I think the main thing was to move Tyrone Tracy down. Now, I don't want to spend too much time going into every single player on this game because, again, by the time you watch this video, this game will have already been played, but I'm going to bounce over to the Cowboys here and talk also from the standpoint of pass catchers because I think there's some interesting things on the Cowboys pass catcher side. So if we change this over here and we take a look at the Dallas and we look at the wide receivers here and we start to take a look at, in particular, let's turn off the Giants so they're not in our way. And we take a look at the pass catchers here. So we see kind of a 3-headed group for the most part here with CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, and Jalen Tolbert operating most of the snaps here. We see Turpin and Jalen Brooks kind of flip-flopping a little bit here the last couple of weeks, but really operating as that 4 and 5. Let's take a look over at the targets and see what kind of opportunities they're getting here. We see CeeDee Lamb as really the clear number 1. Brandon Cooks and Jalen Tolbert both having opportunities as that 2 and 3. And then again, kind of an even 4 and 5. So my expectation would be here that we kind of see a clear 1, kind of a 2 and 3 that are somewhat close, and a 4 and 5 that are somewhat close. And when I go over and look at the projections, that's not really exactly what I'm seeing here. CeeDee Lamb is obviously that clear number 1 here, but the SaberSim projections definitely lean a little bit more as Brandon Cooks as a clear number 2, then a step down to Jalen Tolbert as that number 3, and even getting down to some of these bottom players down here, which are really the ones that I often care about a little bit more. We see Kevontae Turpin and Jalen Brooks here as a half-point discrepancy, is somewhat of a meaningful difference between those two. You'd be surprised how much of a difference a half point can make for these players with these very low projections. So if we take a look then again at the targets or receptions data here, I think Brandon Cooks and Jalen Tolbert being a little bit closer to each other does make a little bit more sense. I think they can both be somewhat equally involved in the offense in the right game script. So right now we have Brandon Cooks at, 3.5 receptions, and we have Jalen Tolbert at 2.5. I think these two players are likely to be actually quite a bit closer to one another in their real projection here. So I'm going to split the difference between them and say this is about 9.5 and this is about 6.5, and maybe we meet at about 8 fantasy points, and I'm going to make an adjustment to each of them here. to adjust that. Again, basically saying that I think in the offense, these two players are actually very similar to one another, and I think the team views them that way. I'm also going to do the same thing with Turpin and Jalen Brooks. When I was preparing for this video, the discrepancy between those two players was actually quite a bit larger, and I was prepared to make a bigger point about these two. It has gotten a little bit closer. It is worth noting at this point in the video that this is something you should be doing after our final sims have run, after inactives have come out, so that you're working with the most up-to-date data and not wasting a ton of time. But I am still going to bring these two in and actually just put them both at 1.5. Again, because I think really, rather than one being the 4 and one being the 5, I find these two players to be roughly equivalent to each other in terms of the snaps and targets and opportunity that they're getting here in the season so far. Now, one other angle that I think is interesting is back to the running backs, this time on the Dallas side here, looking at Rico Dowdle and Ezekiel Elliott and Deuce Vaughn to a lesser extent here, and how they've operated here over the course of the season. If we go back to rushing attempts, we're going to see kind of a similar trend here, but maybe taken a little bit more extreme. We have Ezekiel Elliott going from 10 to 6 to 3. We have Deuce Vaughn not really being involved in week 1 and then having a small role in week 2. And we have Rico Dowdle maintaining a role here on the rush attempts. If we jump over to snaps here, I think this Hunter Luepke snap data is not actually entirely correct, to be quite honest, or perhaps maybe he's including some special team snaps or something else going on there, especially knowing how little rushes he's actually getting. But we see Rico Dowdle with a much clearer trending up on the snap share here, and Ezekiel Elliott going down. Now, this one is one that I think requires a little bit of context for how the game played out here. Dallas was obviously behind in week 3 through most of the game, playing catch up through most of the game. And in weeks 1 and 2, we see Rico Dowdle basically staying a little more static. That said, though, they also got blown out in week 2 and were behind most of the game there. And we still saw Rico Dowdle and Zeke kind of playing more regularly here. So I think this is a meaningful trend. I wouldn't fault anyone by saying that was a game script thing, why Rico Dowdle played more, but I think he's likely to continue to play more, or at least these two should probably be somewhat even in my mind of their opportunities, how much they're likely to play. And it does also seem like Deuce Vaughn has a real role in the rushing attack. So I do want to make sure that he has at least a projection, right? I think he almost paced Zeke on a similar number of rushing attempts here. So I think he's a real player that can be used. If we look at targets, we see also got targeted a couple times. So he's a legitimate player. So if we look at this here, what do we see? We actually see Zeke ahead of Rico Dowdle by a reasonable margin here. And then we see Deuce Vaughn with a somewhat negligible projection here. So I'm gonna move some of this around a little bit. And what I think I'm going to do is, again, I'm gonna hedge this a little bit because I also don't want to throw out that we're getting to the point here where we're talking about players that do have meaningful roles in the offense. So I don't want to throw out what the Sims are saying here, which is basically that we're going to revert back to the mean, at least to some extent, on Ezekiel Elliott. But I don't want to throw that out, but I also want to play these two a little bit closer. So let's call it 9.5 and 12.5 here, and say that we should meet at 11 points and basically call those two even. I think you could justify bumping up Rico Dowdle even more, but I'm going to stick there. And I'm also going to give Deuce Vaughn an extra point, again, because I think he's got a role in this offense. I think he's operating as a player that actually plays, right? We're giving him less than a rush attempt. I think he's likely to get more than that. We're giving him a quarter of a reception. I think we're probably going to see 2 targets. So I'm going to bump him up there as well. Now, again, I'm not researching every single player on the slate. I typically will go through and I will look at snaps, I will look at targets, and I will look at rush attempts for the running backs, the wide receivers, and tight ends with an eye towards the lower projected players and just see what jumps out to me. And if you make a handful of these adjustments, you're essentially winning on 2 different fronts here. First, if my analysis is sharp, for example, I'm going to be poised to have higher exposures to players that may have additional hidden upside that other models and other players didn't get to see. But even if these adjustments aren't going to add tangible value from a model standpoint, let's say it's just an example, let's say the Sims project a player for 1 point and you change it to 2 and his true projection was 1.5, you've likely still added some additional value to your lineup portfolio by making yourself a bit different from other players. Your 5,000 lineup pool will now have lineups that feature that player more and that are different from what other people may have gotten entirely, and your contest Sims will have made made you more likely to play that player and lineups containing that player that others did not. And again, I'm not an NFL expert. I don't watch every single play of every game, but I've generally found that spending somewhere between 15 to 30 minutes looking into this data will reveal a handful of different spots where I end up going and making an adjustment to projections, and it makes my lineups a little bit more unique. And it also gives me a little bit something extra to watch for and root for in the game. But if this type of research isn't really for you, or if it is, but you want to continue to go even further, there are some other adjustments that you can make that have more to do with the raw lineup construction of your builds. And before that, I want to emphasize that these next tips in particular are going to be best suited for large field GPPs. They can still be useful for smaller tournaments, but you will want to adjust the way you're applying these rules accordingly. And as a very broad rule of thumb, the strategies that I'm about to talk about here, I mostly employ for contests that are over 50,000 total entrants. And I like to think about this side of the game as avoiding incidental dupes. Most of the lineups that grade out well in our contest sims are going to have very low expected dupes or just be straight up expected to be unique. But these ROIs that you see for these lineups here are very fragile to being duplicated any more than being expected. Even a handful of dupes will lower the ROI of a lineup dramatically here, and the jump from being duplicated 10 or more times from 0, if that were to happen, can sometimes turn a lineup from being very, very profitable to being completely unprofitable in the post-contest sims. Our contest sims may assume that a lineup is going to be unique, but there is inherently a lot of noise with that measurement. Other DFS players may just kind of wander into a particular lineup almost by chance. There's a range of possible outcomes for how likely a lineup is to be played anyway. And we also already know that identifying a lineup as unique does put a bit of a flag on that lineup that other sim users may also see it. But we can avoid some of these incidental dupes, as I call them, by playing lineups that are just less likely to be played by other players for one reason or another. And one of the absolute easiest ways to do this is to just set a maximum salary cap on your build. Players building their lineups by hand or using traditional optimizers, or even to a lesser extent using sims to build lineups, are likely going to favor using most, if not all, of the available salary for most of their lineups. And there is often a significant difference in the number of duplicates for two lineups. One, for example, using the full 50,000 salary, and one using, for example, 48,500 salary, even if the projection difference or the optimal rate between those two lineups is negligible. Now, if you study the top 150 maxers in NFL Showdown by sorting by sim ROI and filtering by the top 150 to just see who are the best maxers of these contests, the salary thing is probably the very first thing that's going to jump out to you. These players are generally going to grade out as having very high ROIs in their portfolio because they're playing lineups and avoiding lineups that are massively duplicated. These dupes in this average dupe column here are generally pretty low actually relative to the size of this contest here, and their average salary used in a lot of these lineups is often much less than the max. Now, it doesn't always work out. This is going to be slate dependent here, but you'll see generally there is a correlation to players having a higher sim ROI when their dupe numbers are lower, and when their dupe numbers are lower when their salaries on average are lower. And again, this is very slate dependent. On some slates, you'll find that setting even a 49,500 salary cap will lower the number of plus ROI lineups in your pool very quickly. In others where there are gross player misprices, the Jordan Mason Showdown slate from early this season comes to mind, a 48,000 salary cap may not even actually be limiting to your build, and the highest projected lineup may only have a salary of 48,000 to begin with. You will see a little bit of variety there, slate to slate, with how some of the top 150 maxers play, as well with how they allocate their salary, so you should be aware of that slate dependence here. When it comes to my process, what I'll actually typically end up doing here is I'll start by building the top 10 or so projected optimals to get a sense of how much salary they use, and then set a max cap of anywhere from 500 to 1,000 less than that. I'll run a test build, then run my contest sims, and use a lineup filter and get a sense of how much of my pool is profitable compared to the initial build. I realize that might be a little bit confusing, so let me just demo it here exactly for this slate. So what I'll do is, first of all, I'm going to create a new build, so I'm not using the changed projections that I had just a minute ago, and I'm going to just change this to optimizer mode, and then make the two changes to projections here. All I'm trying to do is basically get a sense of what's the best possible lineup you can make by projection, and how much salary does it use. So let's just do 10 lineups. Whoops, not 210. Let's just do 10 and see. Okay, so now this build's done, and let's sort by projected score. And most of the time on like typical slates, it's going to use quite a bit of salary here. We see, so the third highest optimal is 50K salary here. It is a less than a half a point off of the top overall lineup. So I think people basically, if they're building with traditional optimizers, they're building by hands, they're going to be totally incentivized to use the full salary here. So this is a fairly normal slate. So I'm going to experiment then with instead setting my salary cap here, increasing this back up to 5,000 and setting the min salary to 0 with a min salary cap of 49,000. I'll typically try my first build with a salary cap 100 less than that top projected optimal, just to see what the lineups actually end up looking like here. Okay, so now that these salary limited lineups here are built, we can run another contest sim. And what we're going to do here, while this is running, I'll bounce back over to the previous build. And what I'm going to do as kind of a metric for determining the impact of this change is I am going to create a filter that filters by contest sims, target contest ROI, and filters out lineups that aren't expected to be profitable. And it'll just give us a sense of the impact that this is having on our build. So we're trashing about 3,800 lineups using a default SaberSim build here, leaving us 1,200 lineups that are on average profitable in the contest portfolios that we're playing here. So when we go back to build 2 and we have this salary floor or this salary ceiling, we can see the impact that it's having, what percentage of our lineups now is still profitable in these contests. Okay, so the contest sim is complete. And now let's go ahead and add another filter here. And that should still be the same thing. And we'll see the impact. So this time now we are leaving ourselves with 730 lineups. We're eliminating 4,200. That's actually, I feel like, okay with me. That's not necessarily a totally bad measurement. We don't want to really be eliminating the entire pool or enormous chunks of the pool here. It is expected that you will have less profitable lineups when you set the salary ceiling. And it's also expected that some of these lineups ROI may be measured as lower values than in the initial build, but we are now playing lineups that, in theory, are less likely to run into incidental dupes because they are played at a lower salary range that is just less likely for people to stumble onto them. Now, another similar lineup construction strategy that you can use to limit some of these incidental dupes is limiting the geometric mean of ownership of your lineups. And I've talked about this quite a bit in the past, but I want to be very clear about how I think this should be used intelligently because it is very easy to do more harm than good with geometric mean. First, the mathematical assumption that makes this whole thing work is that you can treat each player's ownership projection as a probability that they are entered into any given lineup. And then if you treat these any six players as being entered into any given lineup as all independent from each other, the probability that a lineup is played in a contest is equal to its ownership product. And then you can take that and multiply it by the number of entries in the contest and come up with an expected dupes calculation. Geomean specifically is just a different way to present the product that makes it a lot easier to read, and I'll show you how to mathematically calculate that from the ownership product in just a second here. But I want to be very clear up front that players being played into a lineup are not independent from one another, and the geomean calculation assumes that they are. Looking at this lineup, for example, a player that plays CD lineup captain is far more likely to use Dak Prescott in flex than the ownership product that these two would actually indicate. And furthermore, ownership products and geomeans are very sensitive to the low projected owned players. A player coming in at 3% ownership instead of 0.5% as projected would lead to massively different ownership products or geomeans. With all that said, a geomean cap set relatively high is a useful way of avoiding lineups that purely based on the math of the ownership projections could end up duped more than expected. Where you really run into trouble with geomean is setting an extremely low threshold and trying to use geomean calculations alone as a way to force your lineups to be unique or be under 5 dupes or under 10 dupes or something like that. So here's the actual math equation that you want to write down if you're using these rules. Geomean of ownership equals the max dupes that you want for any given lineup divided by the contest size of the contest you're playing, and then you take that and put that to the 1/6 power. And when you're calculating this out, again, don't use this to try to force 100% unique lineups or you will end up with a pool of garbage. I will typically set my threshold for this pretty high, and for large field tournaments, anywhere from like 25 to 50 desired dupes. And then you'll want to do the same thing you're doing here with salary. So you'll input this, test it out, and see the impact it has on your build. So let's go ahead and look at this here. First of all, the main contest that I have in my portfolio right now where this would apply is this $3.20 max. And that has 158,000 entrants. So if we pull up Google Calculator, we can take, let's say we'll start with, say, 25-ish dupes as our first threshold. So we're going to take 25, which is the max dupes we'd want in a given lineup, and divide that by 158,000, which is the contest size. And then we're going to take that here to the power of 1/6. So this is the maximum geomean that our lineups can have for an expected dupe of any given lineup to be less than 25. And SaberSim will take this number as a percentage. So we'll round down and just say it's 23 here. So let's go back now to build number 2, which is kind of the build that we've been working with for all of this here, and input another rule here. And I'm gonna do this up front ahead of time in the build because I wanna make sure my pool is as many lineups in my pool are potentially playable as possible. So I'm going to do this as a rule instead of a filter here. And I already have a couple of these rules in here, but we'll go ahead and open this ownership cap rule up. And let's change this actually to the geometric mean. I've explored those sum rules before, but let's use geometric mean. So my ownership geometric mean is no more than, we're going to actually put this at 23 as a starting point. So now that's going to dictate how our lineups can look when you're looking at the combination of players combined together. We're basically, again, trying to find lineups that are less likely to be incidentally duped here. I am curious, while we're doing this, I'm going to actually add a new filter here. One thing you can do is I'm going to add a geometric mean here as a custom metric so that I can use this. So we're going to call this geomean of ownership, and we're going to call that ownership geomean value. And then I am curious, before I even rebuild, I'm just going to set a filter that says hide lineups with geomean greater than 23 and see how many additional lineups that filters out. So that's going to filter out another 300 or so lineups. That's still leaving us with a pool of 462. I'm actually pretty impressed that that didn't take away more lineups. I think that's actually pretty good. But what I really want to do is I want to rebuild a pool of lineups that is now following the geomean rule and following the max salary rules to see if I can bump that up a little bit higher. Basically, the more lineups that are left in your pool after you have filtered some of this stuff out, the more likely you are to be playing the best possible lineups into your contest. So if I can bump up the size of my real pool, then I want to do that. Okay, so now our build is complete. One thing to note, the builds will take longer here as you are starting to add in some of these rules, but let's run another contest sim and see what percentage of our portfolio remains profitable here, and if we want to relax either the geomean or the salary rule here first. I would generally lean on the side of relaxing the geomean if you're torn between those two, but that's somewhat personal preference here. While this contest sim is running, I will call out as well, one thing you should check when using the geomean rule is just be aware of your exposure to very low projected players, because those players are going to have very low ownerships, and the easiest way to get very low geomeans are to slam in players with very low ownerships in your build. So you will want to make sure that you are comfortable with some of the very low owned and low projected players that will show up as a result of setting a ownership, a geomean cap, and either filtering those players out from your pool if you don't want them, or increasing the geomean cap so that you naturally get less of them here. Our contest sim is complete, so let's add a filter in one more time here and see what we get. So we're still at about 457 profitable lineups here. In this particular case, again, I'd probably be fine with that number, knowing that I'm only trying to play 20 or so lineups. We're going to start to get some pretty unique builds here, but lineups that still grade out as profitable in the contest sim, and once again, are far less likely to be duplicated incidentally by other players following a similar process. And a big reason why these lineup construction type rules work, or that this process kind of works, is because you have these contest simulations to backstop you from going too far. Instead of having to kind of fly blind with the max salary cap or the geomean of ownership cap, you can just simply test this out, run different builds, see the impact that that's having on how many of your lineups are profitable, what impact is that having on your exposures, and then tweak those rules so that you're happy, right? The more restrictive that these rules are, in theory, the less likely your lineups are to be duplicated. But going back to the original point, potentially the more you're sacrificing in terms of how likely they are to be optimal. So you just want to find that right balance for your particular process. If you have gone objectively too far, it will often be very obvious to you. You will just have eliminated almost your entire pool, or almost like the vast majority of it, like far more than this, and you just won't have any profitable lineups showing up. At that point, you definitely want to relax some of these restrictions. And one of the last ways that you can avoid some incidental duping here is by negatively weighing the factor that is the single most important tool that the vast majority of DFS players are using to build their lineups, and that is, of course, the projections. So you can use a custom metric that is heavily based on ROI, but then slightly negatively weighs average projection. So essentially you make small sacrifices in expected ROI to play lineups that are less likely to have that ROI being ruined by being incidentally duped purely by virtue of being a relatively high projected lineup. So the way you could do this here is in the sorting method here is create a new custom metric, and we'll call this ROI minus proj. And we will set this up here as first the ROI. One thing to note is if you're doing this, you will need to pick a specific contest that you want to do this for its ROI. So let's take actually, you know what? That's not true. We can just use the target contest ROI here. And then we want to set this as a normalized value here. And then to put it on the same scale as projected score, what we're going to do next is then my projection and do sum and also make that a normalized value. And we'll give this a weight of 1, and we'll negatively weight this by, say, -0.1. You'll want to play with your weighting here to see how valuable it is to negatively weight projection versus ROI, but we'll start there. And then what we can do is sort by that instead. And we're already filtering out the lineups that aren't projected at all, but now we're slightly favoring lineups that are still expected to be profitable, but have a lower projected score. And we're going to start really getting into some lineups that I think really are deep into the pool, that grade out as profitable lineups that look good in these large field contests, but are giving up projection. They're giving up salary. They use a combination of players that is unlikely to be used together, and they're probably featuring a handful of players that we ended up making a projection adjustment on. This is a good example of it right here. 47.6. This is a relatively lower salary build. None of our contests expected to be duped. We expect it to be profitable in the play action here. It features Jalen Tolbert, who we bumped up the projection on. All of these things kind of start to come together all at once. Now, on the note of this custom metric here, you will want to be careful on this step if you're playing a bunch of different contests when you actually go to autofill. Autofill is going to use each contest by default. When you're using the target contest ROI, it's going to use each contest's original contest sim ROI. But in the custom metric, you either have to pick a particular contest to use as the ROI, or you're using the average of all of the different contests ROI. So I think this is potentially okay, but then you're starting to sacrifice some contest specific nuance there. So what I would probably end up doing here is setting this, either creating this for each of the contests that you're playing using the ROI for each of them if you're not playing too many different contests, or if you're playing a bunch of different contests, maybe just picking out the one where you're most concerned about dupes. Maybe it's the largest field, 150 max, like the Milli Maker or the Mini Max, whatever you're particularly playing in that case, and set the ROI equal to that. So you do this instead, where it's just the Showdown ROI. And then I can sort this by target contest ROI so that the huddle and the play and the cover 4 are going to get their original ROIs, where I'm a little bit less concerned about dupes there. But I can change this to be ROI proj. And now what it's going to do is it's going to take basically the projection D-weighted measurement for the play action, and for the other two contests, it's going to take the original ROI there. So again, as you're going through this, if you're following me along to this point, you would really want to make sure that you're happy with the way that your exposures end up looking here. Sometimes even if you're getting lineups that show up as profitable, you may be surprised to see some particularly low projected players showing up as some of the players in your entries file. You want to make sure that you're comfortable with that here. So I will typically, once I've kind of got everything set up, run the build and take a look at the exposures and make sure I'm happy with the results. I also, at this point in the process, want to stress that if you just take everything I've outlined here step for step and try to implement this identically in your builds, you have somewhat missed the point of this video. What I want you to do is experiment with some of these different strategies on your own, and then study the impact that those changes have on your expected ROIs in your contest sims and how they affect your actual dupes and actual ROI in contest flashback. The idea should be here to kind of come up with something that is uniquely yours, whether it is a particular way that you look into the research of individual players, whether it's some of the rules that you're setting to avoid some incidental dupes, or potential sorting methods here where you're leveraging projected score. You could experiment with things like ownership there. If you can't make your lineup's ROI less fragile to being duplicated, which for the most part you really can't, or it's not very easy to, the best way to do that is make your lineups less likely to be duplicated so that that outcome is less likely to occur, and some of these things will help you walk through that. Now, I can't wait to see you as the next solo $1 million shipper on the next NFL Showdown slate. If you are still hungry for more NFL Showdown advice, check out my ultimate guide to NFL Showdown, where not only will I walk through more builds, building lineups for Showdown contests, but also show you how I select my contests, how I allocate my bankroll for NFL Showdown, and also how I review my lineups the next day using contest flashback. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next video.